Well, welcome everyone to CG seminar webinar number 352. That's quite a large number, isn't it? And we have with us today Catherine Montgomery, who's going to talk about international doctoral knowledge and the future of cross-border academic mobility. So at this point, let me introduce Catherine. Catherine Montgomery is Professor of Education and Deputy Executive Dean Global in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Durham. And she focuses on the internationalisation of higher education, and she's got a particular interest in transnational higher education in China and East Asia. Her recent work focuses on mobilities and immobilities in higher education and internationalisation of curriculum and knowledge. A well-known scholar in this domain, someone whose work has influenced me and many others, and it's a great pleasure to have Catherine with us in the CG webinar program. Catherine, the screen is now yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Simon. And thank you very much for the invitation to give a presentation in this series on the future of cross-border mobility. I'm going to talk today about a particular perspective on cross-border mobility in its future, and I'm going to talk about constructing international doctoral research as knowledge and presenting it as a key form of mobility, which is going to be important to the future of mobility and future ways of thinking about mobility, partly but not wholly because of the increasing importance of artificial intelligence and the way that that enables us to construct knowledge differently. I'm going to be drawing on my project, which I've been working on with the British Library, called the EThOS project, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that in a second. But for the moment, if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to share my screen, and I've got some slides, and those will be available at after the webinar as well. So I'll just share my screen with you, if that's okay. I'll just put that on presentation.
Yeah, we can see that, Catherine. That's fine.
Okay, let's just make that into presentation mode. Okay, is that okay in presentation mode now? Yeah.
Very good.
Great. Okay, so I want to start off by talking about the mobility turn a little bit, and its relationship and its impact on internationalization. A conceptualization of mobility as physical student mobility has contributed, I think, and that kind of increasing kind of perseverance of that construct of physical mobility, I think, has contributed to quite a narrow vision for internationalization. And you know, and mobility, the physical mobility's association with elite students has probably also contributed to a kind of continuing overemphasis on Western and elite perspectives. So we need this. We need a much broader conceptualization of mobility, and that's including thinking about mobility, internal mobility within countries, and obviously China is a very large-scale example of that. Mobilities within these large economies such as China. Also mobility as forced migration, particularly between rural and urban contexts, is another kind of shift in that sense of what mobility means. But today I want to talk about the importance of the role of knowledge generation in mobility, and see that as a particular crucial part of the way we think about mobility and the picture of mobility. So just to say a little bit about kind of knowledge, mobility and patterns of travel. So physical, as I said, with student mobility, patterns of travel really do reinforce this kind of narrow conception of mobility, but you know, it's also really bound up in something more complex than that, which is a kind of the patterns of travel from south to north in physical mobility for academics. It does reflect an impact on patterns of knowledge mobility as well. So if we think about Pauline Hautonji's concept of extraversion, which is the phenomenon whereby researchers in the global south defer to the knowledge of the global north. And that's a very, very persistent trope, and it's also reinforced by these patterns of travel, very closely bound up in universities' governance and neoliberalism. And this has a huge impact on so kind of these patterns of travel and these patterns of knowledge, directions of knowledge are very influential, and mean that as Connell notes, universities quite often have a narrow knowledge system that's embedded in a kind of system of social inequalities. So I want to talk about international doctoral mobility as knowledge generation. So there's a lot of literature which suggests that internationally doctoral mobile students play a really crucial role in generating knowledge and innovation in universities. These flows of doctoral students, they're highly skilled migrants, they constitute, real opportunity for creating knowledge across boundaries and across transnational and international boundaries. But the fact remains that actually we don't think of doctoral knowledge as a kind of coherent body of knowledge. And if you think about the ways that doctorates are used after they're completed, I'm going to talk about the EThOS collection in a moment, but when doctorates are finished, certainly in the UK, each doctorate is stored in the EThOS collection. And these are very often consulted as individual pieces of research. But this is an important distinction in what I'm doing. I'm thinking of the knowledge which is possible across those doctorates, not as individual pieces of research, but as a whole body of knowledge. And we don't really think of doctoral knowledge in that way, but it offers us huge opportunities for thinking. And that's what I'm going to try to demonstrate today in some of the work that we've been doing. And this is very, very, it's becoming much more influenced by the development of artificial intelligence. And again, I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment, but AI, natural language processing, language clustering in using artificial intelligence offers us an opportunity to do this quickly and efficiently, and in ways that we probably couldn't do just without using what I call by hand processing. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So I want to talk a little bit about the EThOS collection. I've been working for about 3 years now with the British Library. We've had two funded ESRC projects, Impact Fund, the ESRC Impact Fund, and so EThOS contains about 500,000 doctorates, and these are the doctorates which over time, I mean, they have historical documents in EThOS going back to the 1700s, 1800s, but obviously the possibility of putting those digital collections in the PDFs of theses has kind of increased with digital scholarship and digital possibilities. So now the EThOS collection holds about 500,000 doctoral theses, and that's just the British collection. So that if you think about that in one way, that's 1.5 million years of research. If each doctorate takes 3 years, then it's 1.5 million years of research. And we don't think about it like that. We don't think about it across those doctoral theses and the possibilities that those offer. So I've been working on this with the British Library for the last few years. I started off working with the British Library labs, which are research labs. If you don't know about these, look them up, because they're doing incredible stuff with digital scholarship, with photographs, with all sorts of artificial intelligence techniques that do things like read 17th century handwriting or read musical scores, and they're digitizing all of that, and it's fantastic, interesting stuff. So I started off in about 2017 working with these British Library labs, and so I did some work by hand with EThOS. So that was basically looking at the EThOS collection, using their search tool to download doctoral theses. And I produced this paper in 2019. What I did to start with was I was looking at internationalization, because obviously that's my research field. So I downloaded 300 doctoral theses and tried to put them into NVivo, which immediately crashed. I tried several times to do that, and the volume and the size of the data is just so huge. If you think about 300 theses, then those have got 100,000 words each, plus any kind of images or equations or whatever they have in them. So I did do this by hand. I eventually got a set of 100 theses, and I read those individually by hand, which, as you can imagine, probably took, well, it did take a long time. But what I found from that first exploration was quite interesting, because of that sort of 98, that group of 98 theses, there was a huge predominance of adherence to Western theory, and I looked mainly at the international doctoral students, because half of those theses in the EThOS collection are written by international students. So obviously you can see that this offers us a huge kind of, it's not just a national research, it offers insights into countries and country contexts that are being researched by insiders. Very important perspectives that these are offering us. But one thing that I did find is that in the theses that looked at internationalization, there was a huge predominance of use of Western theory, where students were using Western theory to explore their own country contexts, which obviously is interesting, but also has these echoes of extroversion, Hautonji's notion of extroversion, where the workers, as Collier et al. Say, workers in the periphery are oriented to be dependent on institutions and knowledge of the global north. So what was happening in the doctoral theses was reflecting that too. Moving on to the project itself. So in 2019, I started working with our computer science department at Durham to try to work out, well, after publishing another paper in 2020, which also took me about 3 weeks to analyze the data with it, I thought surely there's got to be an easier way of doing this. So I was in touch with our computer science department at Durham and linked up with Dr. Craig Stewart, who, and we've been working together and developing, first of all, analysing the EThOS collection, but also working on developing an artificial intelligence tool, which I'm going to say something about in a moment. So the first thing that we did when we started these projects was we tried to do a proof of concept where we could demonstrate that actually this doctoral thesis knowledge was had potential to have impact beyond the academy. So what we did first was we worked with the British Library to find out who had used the doctoral thesis repository before and how they'd used it. So there's quite a few examples, but the ones that we picked out were these three. One was the Royal Society of Chemistry, which you see on the screen at the left. On the right, Alzheimer's Research had also used the repository, and also a project called FLAX, which was being led by Dr. Alana Fitzgerald from Waikato University in New Zealand. And these were using the EThOS collection in various different ways, but were all demonstrating that this research has huge potential impact beyond just the individual thesis. So I'll tell you about the Royal Society of Chemistry one very quickly. They employed 10 researchers for a year to look for chemical compounds in EThOS. So they were actually looking for equations, they were looking for diagrams of compounds, and what they found was they actually found more than 70,000 chemical compounds inside the EThOS collection, which had not been registered on the national register of chemical compounds called ChemSpider. But that project took them a whole year, but they did demonstrate that inside those doctoral theses was new research knowledge that hadn't been surfaced previously. The Alzheimer's research one was slightly different because it looked at the careers of the people who had done the doctorates and where they'd gone to, and their future careers, demonstrating that actually people in that field didn't stay in the field that long. But again, that was a project that lasted about 2 years. It had researchers, you know, they were working by hand with the theses. So what we started to do was we tried to develop, obviously this is not my field, artificial intelligence is not my field, so it was brilliant and really enlightening to have worked with computer science to develop this tool. We've now got a prototype of the tool after 2 years, working with research assistants and also with students, PhD students and postdocs, and we had a small amount of money, and we got these casual research assistants to develop this tool, which is basically what the tool does is it reads very large numbers of theses. It works best actually with 100 theses. After that, it gets a bit clunky, but it reads the theses. It at the moment we have to give it a set of theses, but if you give it 100 theses, it will read those. It will group them, and it will give them a title. So each group gets a title. And let's say there's 10 theses under each of those groups, it will generate an artificial intelligence paragraph or 2 paragraphs in summary of what those 10 theses are about. So the big difference between that and a normal search is basically if you search the EThOS collection normal summary, you'll get maybe 200 theses. You are then left to read those one by one and to generate themes. But what this tool does is actually it automatically generates groups of theses and themes, and it will write this summary. So it's a little bit like ChatGTP, but I would argue it's better than ChatGTP. If any of you use ChatGTP, you'll know that there's quite a lot of limitations in the numbers of words that ChatGTP can use. About, I think, again, the optimum number of words for ChatGTP is about 6,000 words. But if you think about doctoral theses, each one has probably got about 100,000 words in it. So 100,000 times 100,000 words is the kind of amounts that we're putting into this tool. It's not perfect yet. It's just a prototype. But we've been working on that. And then what we did was we tested it out. So we got the tool and we tested it out with some people in scientific organizations. And we had a few, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about the work we did with Kew Science. You probably know about Kew Gardens. We got, and again, we got these contacts through the British Library. So, you know, we were able to use the British Library's contacts, and they had these great contacts with Kew Gardens. So we got in touch with a scientist. They've got about 200 scientists at Kew Gardens. One of them is Dr. Gwil Lewis, who worked with us very generously. He's an expert on leguminosae, which, you know, obviously species and plant species is his area. So what we did was we talked to Gwil. We asked him what his questions were, what he wanted to know, and then we put those questions through our new prototype of the tool, and it generated some outcomes. Quite interestingly for this one, it generated about an initial list of about 231 doctoral theses, again, quite big data set to work with. And then what we had to do, because we hadn't, I'll say something about that in a minute, but we were doing a by hand search to get through those 231 at the time, and we generated 11 from that list which were more relevant, and 9 of those 11 were already known to Gwil Lewis, but 2 doctoral theses generated something that Gwil Lewis didn't know, that he thought added to his discipline and to his knowledge. I mean, I can say a little bit more later about why we did it by hand, but basically there's another part of the tool that's not finished yet, which is we've called very unattractively called the sniffer, which when you get a smaller group of theses, you can put into that tool a kind of template, and the template will then find other bits of text which is like that template, and then it generates a different perspective from the tool I was talking about before, but I'm getting a bit technical there, so I'll stop. Anyway, to cut a long story short, what we proved through those impact projects was that there is knowledge in the international doctoral thesis set. There is knowledge which is useful, not just useful, but contributes to the development of disciplines. And we worked also with the Museum of Archaeology in London and a couple of other places that were, well, apart from anything else, really interesting just to work with those people. So what am I saying about knowledge? What am I saying about mobility of knowledge here? Because what I am saying is that what we're aiming for in generating knowledge is to have diversity in knowledge. So, making this marginalised doctoral knowledge and doctoral research into something that can contribute to disciplines enabled by artificial intelligence is really important, and because it will help us to have a diversity in research and knowledge production. And when I'm saying diversity, I'm thinking about international diversity, I'm thinking about ethnic diversity, I'm thinking about all those kinds of characteristics, gender, diversity in knowledge. It enables us to get a broader picture, particularly in this example using doctoral research, but generally research has shown that diverse knowledge contributes to good science, and that is the principle, one of the key principles of international collaboration and international research. So that's what we're aiming for. But there are some challenges, and I don't want to finish on a depressing note, but I want to just say something about some of the challenges that we have and some of the challenges of that EThOS collection, because in the first paper that I did, I constructed that doctoral knowledge as Southern knowledge, but in some ways that is problematic because obviously Southern knowledge is not geographic. The students who are coming from those different national contexts that we call problematically the global South may or may not be part of a kind of privileged mobile network, an elite mobile network. So, we have to think about that, the doctoral knowledge construct, as being influenced actually by these elite mobile networks, because, as we know, doctoral students either fund themselves or they're funded by scholarship programs in their home countries, and the capacity to access those scholarship funds in home countries is varied. Again, it's another example of how the kind of marketized system of international higher education is limiting the construction of knowledge, and how the sort of neoliberal elements of internationalization are still having an effect on the diversity of knowledge production. Another thing that I want to raise as a huge influence on doctoral knowledge is the institutional and supervisory partnerships, the relationships between supervisors and their students. Obviously, this is part of a kind of classed and gendered system of higher education that we have, where supervisory relationships are often between privileged professors, often not always white male professors who are engaging with quite often female international doctoral students. We have a lot of challenging power relationships in that picture that we need to think about, so it's a kind of racialized, classed and gendered relationship, and also doctoral knowledge can only develop within the confines of what the institution allows, and we have systems, assessment systems of doctoral research have this influence. That research is highly institutionalized, and as I said at the beginning, if universities work with this narrow knowledge system, then that institutional knowledge system impacts on the outcomes of doctoral research and doctoral theses. So it makes it challenging for students, international students, to participate on their own terms, and to bring that alternative forms of knowledge. Just going back to what I was saying before about the dominance of Western knowledge, for that non-Western knowledge to make an appearance, there needs to be space in the university and space in these supervisory relationships for that to appear. And, you know, so we do have some kind of challenges to international mobility, and, you know, is a question of whether this sort of mobility is kind of quasi-international knowledge. You know, and Shah Jahan and Kayser talk about methodological nationalism and talk about how methodologies contribute to this narrow knowledge set, and that is, you know, again, epistemologies of the South and decolonizing research methodologies. Linda Tuiai Smith and Boaventura de Sousa Santos write about this very clearly, about the methodological, the colonization of methodological approaches, which have this huge impact on the outcomes of knowledge. And again, you know, this pervasiveness of extroversion in the orientation to world centers of research. So I'm coming to a conclusion now, but I just wanted to say one thing about these huge doctoral repositories. The UK is not the only place that has these doctoral repositories. There's pretty much, you know, many countries across the world have these. So it's a huge potential for comparative analysis, as well as for, you know, for national analysis and the internationalization of knowledge within each country context. You could look across the different, and we've started to think about that. I've started to look at NARCIS, which is the repository in the Netherlands. It's a smaller repository than EThOS, but also very interesting. Lots of countries have these repositories. In the United States, it's ProQuest, and that's a little bit controversial because you have to actually pay for access to that, to ProQuest. It's a private you know, collection, and you know, this thing about access is also very important. EThOS is not the only collection in the UK. I've begun working with the Bodleian libraries, because the Bodleian has the Oxford Research Archive, which is really interesting. They have their doctorates alongside articles and papers and grey literature, which is really interesting, and they have their own system of searching, and we've talked to them about our tool and whether they would like to, you know, they said that they would allow us to let our tool loose on the ORA, which is quite exciting. So, you know, we're still working on this, and thinking about how, you know, what the potential is for these repositories and our ways of thinking and our ways of constructing knowledge. And we're working particularly in doctoral knowledge, but there's, you know, a lot of ways that we could construct this differently. So I'm going to stop there, and in the slides there's all the references, and you know, which if you want you can follow up, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm not sure how well I'm doing on time, but I think it's not too bad. Might be just to the minute.
Indeed. Perfect.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'll pause there. I'm really happy to take questions or to have a discussion about this.
And the questions are just coming in now, Catherine. I might ask a couple, and we'll bring in Jim McKinley, who had an interesting question early on, and Laura Shepherd has just put one in the chat as well. A lot of things arise for me from your presentation, because they're the things I'm thinking about myself, I have to say. All the dilemmas and problems we have here, and trying to open things up, you know. I mean, you know, what Raewyn Connell said, we don't want another dominant idea, you know, we don't want to erect a kind of anti-hegemon as a hegemon. We don't want to establish, you know, a kind of Rawlsian rule that says that if it's not from the hegemonic countries, it must be better. You know, we don't want to do that sort of thing. We want to throw the whole question open, interpretations open, and new theorizations, new concepts freely emerging and so on, and them coming from places where they haven't come from before would, of course, be great. I mean, how do we do this? You think about how we all were when we were doctoral students, when we were trying to work out what we thought. I I mean, you do search for authority, intellectual authority. You look for something you can work with that can become ideally sort of central to your own thinking and used as a basis for everything you do. And what you tend to do is you tend to follow established trails. You're influenced by mentors or even colleagues, people who are on the same plane as you, that are persuasive or convincing, and often enough that'll take you down the trail of reproducing the dominant patterns. So how does someone who's coming, just beginning to make the transition into becoming a fully autonomous researcher, how do they begin to open things up for themselves the way that you would like us to, so that we're not simply adopting the same set of ideas that have been dominant for decades?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's very complex, and totally agree with what you've just said there about. I mean, what I'm not suggesting at all that we kind of cancel Western knowledge. I mean, that's just that it doesn't make sense either. But I mean, I think the place to look is, first of all, within our institutions, because there's so many limiting structures and institutional structures which limit the space for alternative ways of thinking, and particularly, but not exclusively, I'm not laying the blame at kind of supervisory relationships, but that is a place where we could start. So I think it's not, and I agree with you, as a doctoral student, you're still searching for those patterns. So I think there's also a responsibility on us as supervisors and as senior, kind of, I suppose, senior or established researchers, if you like, to question and reflect on our own kind of ways of thinking and our own use of ideas, and the way we conceptualize things, and how quickly we adopt those patterns, that the patterns of thinking that we're so used to, how easily we kind of follow those with our students, I think. I think
that's good, though. That gives us two things to start with.
Yeah.
I mean, that supervisors shouldn't program students, that they should make up their own minds. That's quite fundamental. And in my experience, roughly half of my colleagues try and program people and expect them to follow their views, and the other half don't.
Yes.
I don't know whether those halves are the same size exactly, but probably varies from place to place. But there is, and also from discipline to discipline, because some disciplines tend to be more authoritarian or authoritative, or in a negative sense, than others. But that's one thing. So encouraging people to work it out for themselves, not just saying you should follow this line of thought, my line of thought, or this particular theory and not another. You should decide for yourself. I think that is really important. And the other one is probably, I think you were saying this first, expose people to plural ideas, provide in a department, in a course of study, and especially in a doctoral culture, having different strands of interpretation available and all valued in some way, and or given legitimacy, if you like. And that begins to bring more possibilities onto the table. I suspect plurality of ideas is harder to achieve than plurality of diversity of voices. We can structure our intake of students and staff so that we can make that more plural, and we're doing that to an extent, having achieved more with gender probably than the other categories in education, at least. But creating plural ideas is a challenge beyond that, and quite demanding. And the sort of classical Chinese approach of admitting many different schools of thought and seeing what happens when they blend together, I think it's really healthy. But it's not many departments that I know actually function that way. So it's although some do to a degree. Another question is Global South. You said Global South's not a satisfactory term, problematic term. I wonder if you thought about an alternative to that.
That is really tricky, and searching for these terms, all of the terms that you find are you know, have their challenges, don't they? So thinking about the problem with the global south is that it's not geographic, is it? So within the global south you have elitism and privilege. So I mean, I think the one that I kind of found the least problematic was marginalised.
Yeah.
So marginalised knowledge, marginalised communities, because that gets at the you know, the disadvantage in, you know, you can have marginalised knowledge in the UK, you could have marginalised knowledge in, you know, the United States is a really good example of these huge, you know, economies where there's a lot of marginalisation. So I kind of went for marginalised, but you know, obviously you fall into the trap of using global south because it's people will understand that in the context of internationalization. But you know, I think you know, I think that would be the one for me as a term. Yeah, I mean, I think there's, you know, there's huge challenges, huge complexities in this too.
Yeah, global south's kind of fixed, isn't it? It's
yeah.
Whereas marginal is a construction of human organisation, human practice. So it can be changed. I worry about centre periphery a bit because it appears to install a centre forever, you know, and I think that's what happened with Wallerstein's idea that, you know, people just saw the centre periphery arrangement as inevitable, and he argued himself that it was very difficult to move out of the periphery. You know, it gets to, but marginal is better because it's more reversible, more changeable, presumably. One more question.
Alternative as well, I think, is a more positive one than marginalised. So alternative perspectives, and is you know, that kind of captures that kind of a more positive sort of slant on marginalisation, I think. Yeah,
if you say heterodox, no one knows what you're talking about. So alternatives better. One more question from me before I bring in Jim. The multiple languages problem seems to me potentially, if we could crack this, you know, create a more plural conversation. Presumably that though means translating into English, if not another global language. And that's the translation seems to be the process that's so far defeating. Is it defeating us? Is the software within reach of this problem, do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, that's the amazing thing about artificial intelligence. I mean, we haven't grappled in the project I've been involved with. We haven't grappled yet with that kind of software, but it's definitely there. So you know, this is where artificial intelligence offers us huge opportunities, because immediate translation of papers, and then, you know, you could use the tool in the same way. Either you do it before it was translated and get the tool to work with Chinese, for example, or you could work with translations. I think there's two possibilities there. You know, the next thing we're you know, we've got lots and lots of ideas, but that would be pretty amazing, you know, because at the moment we're identifying repositories that are in English. So we haven't even got as far as kind of thinking about that translation tool, but you know, artificial intelligence can definitely do it.
Well, there's 5,000 centres of higher education studies of some kind in China. There's a huge conversation in Spanish and Portuguese about the universities, which seems to be a bit stronger than the English language one in some respects. I mean, just in my own fields of work, I think that you know, it's potentially transformative. We'll just see strands of conversation that we didn't know existed, we English speakers. So very exciting.
Yeah.
To think that could happen in the next few years.
Yeah.
And you know, everyone's getting enthralled about the probability of their assessment being problematic because of ChatGPT, but this is really positive, I think, this kind of stuff. Now let's bring in Jim.
Sorry, just before you finish on that, Simon, I was just going to say we do want to look at ChatGPT next, because you're right, it's kind of causing moral panic in the academy, but you know, there are some aspects of ChatGPT that we need to work with positively.
See, what it's made me realise, we how standardised a lot of our approaches are, and we as the higher education editors, we we asked ChatGPT to give us prepare an abstract for COVID-19 research in higher education and COVID-19 impact of COVID-19 in higher education, and out came this really nice, publishable abstract. You thought better than most of the papers I see as a journal editor on this topic, and you think to yourself, just shows how standardized our thinking is, that we recognize this as desirable. This is a good piece, when in fact it's just a replication of all the work that's already been done and nothing original about it whatsoever.
But it will interpret. ChatGPT has got, because I've had a go at it and I put in a paper and it had that summary, the abstract, and the last sentence was an interpretation, which is pretty terrifying, really. So
there you are. Well, Jim, come in. I'm sorry we've held you this long. You've had a couple of things to say in the chat already.
Thank you,
Hi,
Simon.
Jim.
Hi, Catherine. I'm sorry, I'm going to speak gently because I'm in the library. But just wanted to say that this is very impressive, the amount of work that you've done into this. And I think it's very exciting being able to see these trends and the directions that they're taking us in, and to think of, the increased insights that we'll have through AI. So I'm definitely keeping an eye on this. The thing that I was interested in, the question that I posted earlier, was about this adherence that happens with international students to Western constructs and Western theories and methods. And I think about it in education, postgraduate research. It's Bourdieu, it's Foucault, it's the same ones over again, and they come to UCL, to the IOE, because they want to study Basil Bernstein. So redirecting them into a direction that says, but what are the insights that you can bring from your home culture, and what about these other ideas that come from other parts of the world? The biggest problem is they see it all as substandard. They see it as not good enough, and as far as they're concerned, everything is about getting the upgrade, getting the examiners to agree, and they just aren't willing to take what they see as a risk. So how do we redirect that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Jim, and lovely to see you. And I think, this is an issue, and I think, obviously you've identified the structures, like the examination structures and the ways of thinking about those differently. But I think things, there's evidence that things are changing in this. If you look at what's happening in China, in terms of their kind of construction of how they might introduce pedagogies. So, previously, there might have been more of a temptation to adopt Western pedagogy, for example, into China. But now what China are saying in terms of policy is that they want to introduce, ideas like either project-based learning or, that kind of like Western type pedagogy. They want to introduce that with Chinese characteristics. So I think the potential is there for a different way of thinking for those students coming from not just China, any background. So I think, that kind of way of thinking that, we're just going to adopt Bourdieu or communities of practice, or just go for, Foucault or whatever. I think that's changing. I think we can help to change it, as responsible, as professors, or as academics in this system. And I think that is the way that you've just outlined it, as saying, okay, these are important ideas, but what about other ways of thinking? I mean, it's a bit like explaining critical thinking, isn't it? There's no if you adopt an idea like Bourdieu without thinking about whether it's appropriate or not, whatever national context that comes from, that is not a good way to proceed. And you would always say to your students, okay, you're talking about this framework, but have you thought about other frameworks? Have you thought about other ways of thinking about this? So it's kind of critical thinking or interdisciplinarity. These are all helpful kinds of ways of ensuring a kind of, well, not ensuring, but attempting to bring in a kind of more pluralistic way of thinking. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It's the responsibility. I think the answer is the response. It's our responsibility within UK institutions to question that ourselves, for our students and with our students. because we wouldn't want to do that. That's not a good way of thinking ourselves either. Just to, not blindly, but to continually plough the bordure incessantly, without thinking about the other ways of thinking and how they're contextualized. Sorry, that was a long rambling answer, Jim.
Thank you, Catherine.
No, that's a good answer. Laura Shepard.
Hi, just to preface this question, I'm actually doing my PhD using EThOS at the moment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, on gender and higher education inequalities using data science and machine learning.
Amazing.
And I'm based at UCL at the moment. But yeah, so I've been using it. So it's really interesting seeing kind of how people use it differently. And I completely agree of like, it's such a rich resource, and it's kind of frustrating that more people don't use it. Do you know what I mean? There's such a rich piece of information that we kind of don't really look at. But I just kind of wondered like your next steps for the project, and also like, have you looked at like acknowledgements at all within the thesis records, and kind of to pick up on like our specific students, like international students, and does that kind of show patterns and dynamics, I guess, across the institutions, across disciplines? Because I'm maybe just thinking it in terms of the context of my PhD and thinking, oh, well, we see gendered patterns in different disciplines across time, across different institutions as well. So I was just wondering if, and potentially, I don't know if you've looked at using like, mainly the acknowledgements, to be fair.
Right. So when you say acknowledgements, are you talking about the acknowledgements of the individual students? Yeah,
within the thesis. I didn't know if you could do any sort of picking up of information there potentially.
So absolutely, we kind of had started to think about the getting the tool to do that. That's the sniffer. So the sniffer would look for specific, so you could give it a template. So you'd write a paragraph. So you could write something about acknowledgements. So you could write words like, I really appreciate the blah, 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 blah of support. But so you could write that, and then it would you'd let it loose, but you'd have to let it loose on a small group. Well, tool at the moment, you have to look at 100 theses, let the sniffer tool look for those templates inside the theses. So you could do it like that. So you could do that with all sorts of specific bits of the theses. And actually some of the previous projects, you'll know this, Laura, some of the previous projects have looked at specific things. So things like diagrams and pictures and figures are much more difficult to find using artificial intelligence. You need a specific tool for that. And some of the previous projects have looked at that. But in answer to your question about what we're going to do next in the project, what we've been looking at open access issues. So quite a lot of the EThOS collection is behind a firewall, or you don't get a full kind of data set because some universities don't share with EThOS. So I've been looking a little bit at open access. And what we would like to do is kind of get some principles together. What would be the principles of open access? What would be the principles of sharing this material more broadly? And that's why we started working with the Bodleian. Actually, it's why we started working with Oxford Research Archive, because they have a separate one which is just their research for Oxford. And what does that mean, and how can we kind of work together? So we want to look at sort of open access. We want to look internationally and do some comparative work with, I've started working with the University of Virginia in the States, because they've got quite an interesting, they've been working on this as well, and we've got quite an interesting kind of data set there. But obviously that is, limited by ProQuest, by the kind of, again, firewalls and open access. It's a huge thing, and it kind of, all ties in with this kind of elite knowledge system. If we're going to have properly mobile knowledge, it's got to be open access, it's got to be commons. So that's what we're thinking about partly. And what we are going to do is we're going to apply for a big research grant. and we're going to start with the ESRC, because the ESRC fund loads of doctoral students, so surely they're interested in, in the outcomes of that doctoral research. So that's what we'd like to do, and I'm going to be starting some research leave in January, so that's what I'm going to focus on then. You know, so we can, you know, and I mean, actually we've done a lot. We've done a huge amount with just quite a small amount of money, and just using, we've had 2 research assistants, both casual research assistants who have been working, postdocs working in different, one for the computer side and one for the more kind of, I suppose, the thematic side. And that's worked really well. But, you know, for us to move on, I think we need a bit more long-term funding, because there's been 1 year at a time projects. So that's what we'd like to do next.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting.
And also write up everything. Yeah, sorry, Laura.
Yeah,
just gonna say
with the open access stuff, because it's really difficult with you can't get every PhD ever. You can get metadata about it, but that's incomplete anyway. But anyway, maybe this is a conversation.
Love to be in touch and hear more about what you're doing. That would be really good. Get in touch offline. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, I'll let someone else ask a question. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, and good to see your intersection with Catherine's work. QA Dung, you are next, and good to see you back again.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Catherine. Your fantastic work, really inspiring. I just look up my own thesis in EThOS, and to my surprise, I need to contact Bristol University and paying a download fee.
Really?
For it. I wonder whether in your search you come across that cases. But I searched another thesis from Bristol, my friend, and I cannot get access directly from EThOS. So, I mean, your research is really fascinating, but I don't think at a former PhD student in the UK, international PhD student, I don't see that at all negative to understand others' methodology and other theory. I wonder if you know anybody who study doctoral thesis produced in China, because Chinese university hosts large number of international students. I wonder what kind of methodology and theory they use. That would be a kind of a sister project to yours. Interesting to know whether it's Southern theory dominant in those theses. And my next related question is whether your research point to the direction that we need to make some changes in the practice and pedagogy of supervision, simple as composition of the supervisory team. I see the rise of co-tutel programs and dual work program. It could be a composition of supervisors would change the dominance. I mean, of course, some of the Southern scholars are actually very Western in their thinking. That wouldn't help. But do you think that way or another way, the cohort-based supervision would change the equation? Thank you.
I'll start with what you've just said there last. That is a fantastic point. And yes, I mean, we do a lot of those co-tutels at Durham. And, you know, as you say, they're becoming that joint supervision between 2 supervisors is a perfect environment, isn't it, for an opportunity for everybody to rethink their kind of set patterns of theory and ideas, I think. So yes, I would agree with the proviso that you've put in there, that actually some scholars, not all scholars, some scholars in these partner institutions might also have quite Western ways of thinking, because it's not just the geographical location where you are, it's a way of thinking. So, you know, but I totally agree, because at the very least in that relationship you might come up against new ways of new kind of institutional ways, because you know, the structures of the doctorate are very limiting, the structures of the doctorate itself. So, you know, those co-tutels have huge potential, I think. And then just to go back to your other point about the about firewalls, and yeah, I mean, we did come up against this a lot. There's several universities. I didn't know Bristol charged people for that. That's not good at all. You know, that I didn't, you know, I think quite a lot of universities keep these behind their firewalls, but sometimes there's good reasons why doctorates are embargoed, apart from you know, sometimes people embargo their doctorate so they can publish on it, and it kind of comes out new if they've already planned that that publication is going to come out. It came up, got some examples of that in a few studies that we did, but sometimes there's a good reason why a doctorate's embargoed. Sometimes it's threatening to somebody's safety. You know, that the controversial ideas that you know, they don't want to be open access, and you know, there's some challenges for some reason, could be political reasons, you know, in any context, and that's not just, you know, that could happen in the UK as well as in other countries. So, but yes, I mean, this is a big challenge, you know, but it's a challenge. It's outside of the doctoral thesis as well. It's about open access knowledge systems. Yeah. Yeah,
and for every gain we make on open access, we seem to take a step back somewhere else. I mean, this is we're not necessarily transforming the environment at this point. And I think that, you know, the bottom line is that commercial publishers control the journal system, and that's where the authoritative knowledge is going. And the high values, inverted commas, knowledge value partly created artificially by scarcity of through mechanisms such as citations and impact data and so on. And you know, unless we break the journals out of the away from the whole of the publishers, I don't think we're going to be able to solve any problems in the end. I mean, they're going to continue to exercise proprietary control, and whether they do it through inverted commas open access or through the old regime, they're going to charge in one way or another. Just a question of who pays, isn't it? I mean, the idea that you've got to put up £11,000 to get a book published or open access, or you've got to pay, you know, £1,000 to get or dollars to get a journal paper made available, or much more than that, is just obnoxious. And of course, the socioeconomic, you know, effects of that are obvious, aren't they? So we should bring in Se-Yong before we close. Se-Yong's pushing back a bit. Se-Yong.
Hello, thank you very much, Simon. Thank you, Catherine, for your brilliant presentation. Maybe my question is just a comment, I don't know. I just want to be critical about the perspective underlying your research, maybe, because I wonder if, is it also a Western idea that we think that international students should contribute to the diversification of knowledge, because maybe it is for them, it is diversity to go study abroad and study in the UK or to the US and learn their Western theories, because they've grown up in the Asian, Chinese, Korean, or other like countries. Maybe it is diversity for them. So do they really want that? Do they really want to contribute to the diversification of knowledge in the literature? I wonder if it's like reproducing the deficit approach to international students, because if we assume that international students are not that good at, as Jim asked a question, they cannot adopt their original and ethnical local ideas because they are more, anyway. So if we are adopting that deficit models, I thought maybe it could be homogenizing the image of international students. I agree with the point that students should be more critical about, so these Western ideas are not the only options that they have, but I just want to, you know, raise a issue as an international student.
That's great. Thank you, Se-Yong. That's an excellent point. And I have actually and ahed about using the word international doctoral knowledge rather than just saying doctoral knowledge, because actually in both the projects, the by hand projects that I did, I didn't kind of differentiate international, you know, I didn't really have the we didn't have the tool working then, so I didn't kind of differentiate between who is an international student and who isn't, because actually that's not very clear. in EThOS, because you don't get demographic data. So you'd have to then identify a person's name and decide if they're an international student or not. And that's not a very reliable way to do it, because you could have, obviously, your name does not denote your international status. So that's definitely a fantastic point. So I think I did think about, and I kind of gone back and forward on actually just dropping the word international from this, which would I think help a little bit, just to construct it as doctoral knowledge. So I think that might help a little bit with what you're suggesting. But just to go back to what you're suggesting, I think also we have to have diversity in knowledge, whether you're in Korea or whether you're in wherever you are. If you're in South Korea or in whatever country you're in, we can't, it's not a good approach to have a kind of single kind of national way of thinking. And we're seeing this, in the kind of turbulence in the political relationship with China is not going to be a good way forward, because we need this kind of diverse way of thinking. So we need all these different perspectives. So I think what you're saying is the same as that, because you're saying that if South Korean students have had this kind of singular way of thinking, in Southeast Asian ways of thinking, they need the Western knowledge to make it diversified, which I would definitely agree with. But I mean, I think the principle is diversification of knowledge and getting away from methodological nationalism or any kind of nationalism. So yes, but I totally take your point. Don't think that we should be kind of constructing international students as having this kind of necessarily having this singular way of thinking, because that's not the case at all.
Yeah, it is a good point, isn't it? And to make international students the agents of diversity in the West, of course, is to position them in that, so that they get full responsibility, if you like, for the West's own gaps and failings, and they can so easily still be marginalised anyway in doing that. So, yeah, I mean, we've got to be really careful about ascribing people to geopolitical roles here. But I think that the underlying principle is diversity, as Catherine said, and people being able to make up their own minds and have their own voice. And I guess that that the message that the Western educators can give to international doctoral students who are coming to the West is that we welcome what you've got to say. We welcome your perspective. We welcome your insights. We welcome your differences and your similarities both. And we know that you're here to learn, but we welcome the chance to learn from you as well. I think if you say those things enough time, they do mean something, and they do create freedoms for people, which we haven't always given them in the past. So, Catherine, thanks very much. You've got a wonderful style of this kind of discourse, of presenting so clearly and engaging so well. And I think that putting the core ideas out there again and again really clearly, but you're also doing really path-breaking methodological work. So really look forward to seeing what more comes from this, and keep in touch, and hopefully we'll have you back on to talk about mobility and lots of other things in future.
Great. Thanks very much, Simon. And everybody. Thanks for all the really great questions and contributions.
Yep, if we had longer, we could have more, and perhaps we'll have that opportunity again. Well, folks, as Mary has told you in the chat, our series on cross-border academic mobility continues on Thursday with Elaine Courtois talking about mobility or precarity, ? And Elaine is a great presenter, and that'll be a very good webinar. But just to complicate things, tomorrow we have CG is running a face-to-face seminar in London at UCL. And it's not part of the mobility series, it's another topic. And it's about UK higher education policy over the last 10 years. And it's Alastair Jarvis, who used to be the head of Universities UK and is now Pro Vice-Chancellor at the University of London, reflecting on the last 10 years of changes in British higher education, looking forward to the future. And with an election coming up in about a year's time, and with Keir Starmer having announced this morning that Labor Party is not going to abolish tuition fees, but will be in fact putting some kind of mixed funding regime in place. Things are happening in the UK on the policy front. It's one of those rare times when a lot of policy issues are open and there's a chance to change things. And Alastair Jarvis will provide some guidance to us on that question. So look forward to seeing you possibly tomorrow face-to-face in London and at the webinar in 2 days' time on Thursday for Aline Courtois. Meantime, thanks again to Catherine and to everyone. Bye for now.